So syntax bindings, in the slides, and you will get them afterwards, there is information about UBL and cross-industry invoice in more detail, more technical information. I'll skip that now. But I just wanted to show you that the specifications for the syntax bindings are quite long, complex documents. It lists the business terms, and then it points out using X paths, that is like the pointer into the format for which XML element each business term is located in. So this is like the mapping document from the semantic model towards the syntaxes. And there's also the reason why the documents are so long is that the first half is where you have the mapping from the semantic model to the syntax, and then the second half is the other way around it. Based on the syntax, this is where the business term is used. So it's just two perspectives on the same thing. It's not necessarily always a simple pair matching game, you know, like children's books where you draw a line from one. It often presented as if conversion and transformation between syntaxes is very much that. You know, this element is that element, but in reality there is often complications. One thing, even though it's not necessarily such a big issue, but in cross-industry invoice you have the data type for dates is the same approach as in Edifact. It's a string with so today's date would be 2019-05-03 in one string. In UBL, it's with dashes, so it has another format. And in CII, it also have a qualifier saying that what type of format it is. So it doesn't work just to move the data element from one syntax to the other. It also needs to do some tidying up and formatting. And that is one example, but there can be others also. Even though between cross-industry invoice and UBL within the semantic model, when the semantic model is used, that is still somewhat straightforward to convert from one to the other. I would say it's more complicated to move from other formats to the European standard. And I'm sure some of you have been working with Tieke XML and Invoice and mapping that to the European standard or vice versa. And you'll see that there are a lot of challenges there, in both required information but also the quality of information needs to be very high in the European standard for it to work. As I mentioned, the rounding, the slack for rounding, how much rounding is allowed. It's an example of where it can go wrong. So then we have something called usage specifications and compliance, SIAS. Are you aware? Have you heard this concept before, SIAS? Some of you? So I will go through this. This is a bit of, when I said that the standard comes with a cost, that is often a disappointment when you understand about user specifications, sizes. That's the second disappointment on the standard, fortunately. Or is it adjustment to reality, perhaps? Anyway, there are two, when implementing the European standards, there are two mechanisms to make deviations in your implementation. Either you can extend the standard, and there is a methodology on how to make extensions. If you want to add business terms in a specific industry, you can do that with an extension. And if you do it properly, if you add business terms, you can say that your implementation is conformant. So conformant. But then we have another thing. That is, if your implementation is restricting the usage of the European standard, so for example saying that when using e-invoicing in Sweden, you must always state your VAT number. It's taking something. It's not. It's not a real example. But let's say that I'm making an optional element mandatory within an implementation. That is a restriction on the standard, and that falls under what is called the core invoice usage specification, and that is called a compliant implementation of the standard. So if you extend on the core, it can be conformant. If you make restrictions, your implementation can be called compliant. And this has very big consequences. The directive says that the public entities must be able to receive invoices which comply with the European standard. Comply. It doesn't say conform. And the reason here, this is the technical committee made this by purpose. So they allowed, and it was a way of getting out of some really hard situations where some countries said, we must have this in the invoice. If the invoice isn't containing this information, it's not a legal invoice. We must be able to require it. In Italy, we must have this information. Otherwise, we will. It's a step backwards. In Denmark, they say we must have this reference. Unless we are allowed to enforce it, this will be a big step backwards in our invoicing. So, the way to solve that was, okay, let's invent this core invoice user specification mechanism so that the countries can create restricted implementations and still call them compliant. So if we take, for example, UBL, and this is representing the full possibilities, all the business terms in UBL, then the core is a subset of those. We only use a small set, like 200 elements of potentially thousands available in the international standard. But then we have these extensions, so you can add on top of the core with elements, but we also have the user specific, which is a subset of the core. And this is problematic from an interoperability perspective. User specification may never go outside of the core. It has always to be within. So let's take a look at an example. Yeah, it says in the standard, if you want to know what does it mean to comply, you have seen the directive. I must comply to the standard. I look up in the standard in chapter 7, I think. You find a section called compliance of sending and receiving party. And what it says is that a receiving party may only claim compliance to the core invoice model if he accepts invoices that comply with the core invoice model in general. That was the core, let's say, if it complies to this. So if he can receive invoices that using the core, then he can say, I'm compliant to the invoice model. But I'm going in the wrong way. Like this. Or with a size. And this little or here is what's causing us a lot of this disappointment now in some sectors. So you can claim compliance by supporting the core in full, or just the size. And the consequence, and what can be done in the size? This is a list of things that you can do when restricting a data model. Not necessarily good ideas or proposals of what you should do, but this is what's technically allowed, that you can forbid optional elements. You can make optional elements mandatory. So like in Denmark, if they must have a specific reference, they can make that, they can enforce that. You can limit allowed repetitions, you can limit code values, field length, anything that is restricting, limiting is allowed in, it's a restriction, and therefore it's allowed in a size. This is again, these are not good ideas necessarily, but it's allowed. So let's now take an example. We have a receiver here who have implemented the core invoice in full, or in general, as the we read before. And then we have 4 suppliers. One is implementing the EN as is. One is using the Italian SIAS. One is using a SIAS from the Netherlands. And this last guy, he is using extensions, added business terms. Perhaps he has a trading relationship with another industry where he puts a lot of extra data elements in the invoice. He wants to use that also when sending invoices to this guy over here. So in the first case, all instances, all invoices sent should be possible to accept. If they're compliant here, they are compliant there. And the same thing goes here. If I'm using a restricted version of the European standard, as a consequence, all my instances will also be allowed in the core, because I'm just using a limited set. I'm not breaking any rules. And the same for this one. However, here, if it's using one of these extended business terms, there might be problems for the receiver, and it's not considered to be compliant. So this doesn't look very troubling so far. Let's say now that on this side we have an Italian receiver using an Italian SIAS. Let's say that this SIAS requires the presence of a contract reference. Just using that as an example. If I'm then implementing the European standard as is, the contract reference is optional. And if I'm not using that business term, it's still compliant to European standard, but it's not compliant to the Italian SIAS. And he may say that your invoice is not compliant. Someone said the other day that it is a little bit like Schrödinger's cat. You know, the quantum, that you have a cat in a box, and then you don't know if it's alive or dead, and it's like a quantum state. The same thing goes for the European standard, that it is depending on how you look at the invoice. If you measure it against the European standard, it may be compliant. If you measure it against the Italian SIAS, it's not compliant. So it can be compliant and non-compliant at the same time. It's like Schrödinger's cat. That was kind of funny comparison. But this is the reality. If you're using the same SIAS, it's no problem. If you're using the Netherlands SIAS, you may have problems. And the same thing for if you have an extension, you might have problems. So it looks like, why bother with requiring a specific SIAS as a receiver if you have all these problems? And it sounds like it's better than to support the core in full, because then you don't have all these interoperability problems. But in reality, we see now that many countries are going for a SIAS approach. PEPPOL, the PEPPOL BIS, as I mentioned, that is a SIAS. It has made restrictions on the European standard. And why? There are some reasons. In the case of PEPPOL, for example, the endpoint identifiers, the elements that you use to identify the buyer and the seller in the network, those are mandatory in PEPPOL. They are optional in the European standard. So that is one example of a restriction in the PEPPOL SIAS. But PEPPOL has also made other restrictions. For example, the European standard has a very, very long list of different invoice type codes. So you can have an insurance invoice or it's a very long list. And many of those codes have not been documented very well. So you don't know really what it means if it's used. And PEPPOL has a restricted list of those codes. CEF has a list of on the website of different SIAS development projects, and the Finnish SIAS is part of this list, if I remember correctly. It's not a list that is created by this by European Commission. It's based on, it's community driven, so anybody can go in and register this ISV. One thing that PEPPOL is doing is that since the PEPPOL size is used in many countries at the same time, there is still some requirements. For example, in Sweden, we have a set of rules that we would like to validate. That if you use a Swedish organization number, it has this format. If you have a VAT, we only have these 3 rates. And so and on and on. We have a handful of business rules. But instead of us creating a Swedish size, we have something called country-specific rules in PEPPOL that is based on if the seller is Swedish, so if the country code of the seller in the invoice has a specific country code, if it's Swedish, then we have a rule. So that rule would only be relevant for invoices from Swedish suppliers. So that is a way of isolating the Swedish rules to only Swedish suppliers. And all of these, we have now Italian, Norwegian, Danish, and Swedish rules are included in the PEPPOL BIS, but there are more countries being added as country-specific rules. So that means that when we do the validation steps in PEPPOL, we have checked that it's okay XML, that it's using URL or the schema. It tests the validation rules from the European standard, and then the PEPPOL rules, and then we have country-specific rules. And when an invoice is being validated, so here we have a Swedish invoice, it goes through the validation steps, but only invokes the Swedish validation module because it's a Swedish supplier in the invoice. And the same if you have a Dutch invoice, it would then only trigger the Dutch. So that is a way of solving this need for country-specific rules, but still here we can use the same technical specification instead. So here we have the Swedish rules, for example, and these are only relevant for Swedish suppliers. But anybody that downloads the PEPPOL BIS specification will get all of this, but they may not be relevant. Okay. I talked a lot about validation. Schematron is something that is coming up. It's been used in PEPPOL for quite some time now, but it's a very straightforward and simple technique to test the content of an invoice to a certain degree, at least. I will quickly step through this just to describe what it is. You know, XML schemas that has been around for 20 years to check that all the mandatory elements are there and the data types are correct and so on. But then we have schematron that can do more advanced tests. So, for example, I mentioned if an invoice contains a VAT amount, then the supplier VAT number must also be present. That is very complicated to represent in an XML schema, but you can do it in schematron. Or you can check the checksum of a GLN, that the last number has a correct calculation of. And you can do some summation. For example, the invoice total amount is the line amounts plus charges minus allowances. So these type of rules can be defined with the schematron language. It's technically, I don't go through this in detail, but it has typically two types. It's either fatal error, meaning that then the invoice is not compliant, or there's a warning, meaning that this is something that you should look at. It's probably something that you made wrong, but it's not strictly incorrect, but it's a warning. And when validating this, you do the validation with XML schema, and then you test with schematron, and then you process it in your application. In PEPPOL, these steps are mandatory, so you have to do it. You're not allowed to send a message into the network without making sure that it validates also with the schematron. because you don't want to send incorrect messages to your counterpart and then they will have to solve the problem. So then becomes a support case for them. It's your fault. So in the validation service, for example, you can see these different layers of errors. So that was quickly about schematron. I wanted to mention it because it's really central for the European standard, because that's how we measure whether or not an invoice is compliant to the syntax and to the business rules of the standard. So let's change the subject a bit and look at some countries and how they have implemented the European standard and how they implement, or how they have transposed the directive. We're not going in detail, but I want to particularly talk a little bit about Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, and some other countries. So we have here before 2019 and from now and into the future. So we will see a little bit on how is e-invoicing usage been before. In Denmark, for example, 98% of all invoices to public sector are electronic. So they are e-invoicing. Denmark is, of course, they have this legislated since a long time back. And then the main syntax is UBL. They have used UBL since 2018, even before that, with a previous version of UBL, which in Denmark was called XML. But they have been strong UBL users. On infrastructure, they have a network called Nemhandel, where buyers and sellers can exchange messages. So normally you have a service provider that acts on your behalf as a node in the Nemhandel network, and then you can send and receive messages to your counterparts through Nemhandel. Easy trade is translation to English. This is like a prequel to PEPPOL. The PEPPOL project and the PEPPOL infrastructure defined in the PEPPOL project was very much based on initiatives from Denmark and the Nemhandel people, so it builds on that. And for looking now into the future, Denmark is going to use the PEPPOL SIAS, and they have these domestic rules, as I mentioned, for Danish suppliers. Oops. For infrastructure, they see that they will use PEPPOL and Nemhandel in parallel, but PEPPOL long term. Technically, they are providing the same functionality, so to have two infrastructures is adding costs without much additional value. But so now I understand this month all the public entities in Denmark will be registered as receivers in PEPPOL in parallel with Nemhandel. And for legislation, e-invoicing is already mandated on the suppliers by law. So they have this law. What is new is that some types of public entities, like publicly owned companies, which was previously not included under the law, is now going. So there is a change, even for Denmark, there is some change process.
One question.
Yes?
Concerning the plans for infrastructure, public sector is mandated to register in PEPPOL. What about corporate?
So if the question was if there will be mandates for corporate buyers, for suppliers to be registered. No, and it's not in Nemhandel neither. So it's not mandatory to send electronic invoices to suppliers in Denmark. So it's more, even though invoicing is used a lot, also business to business, it's not mandated. But most of the service providers who provide NEM-handle functionality also provides PEPPOL functionality. So it's saying it doesn't mean that you have to change service providers, just that you use an additional functionality. Christian, do you want to add anything on?
No, that's fine.
And for Sweden, we have had approximately 50% of the invoices to local and regional authorities are electronic, 60% to the government authorities. These numbers are a bit old. I think it's a little bit higher for publicly owned companies, energy companies, and things like that. We don't have any numbers. What my gut feeling is that they are very low. So, and UBL, Svefaktura is based on UBL, and then we've been using the PEPPOL BIS as Svefaktura 2. So UBL has been in public sector the main format. Infrastructure, we had various infrastructure, then service providers, banks, different constellations of service providers. I know in Finland you have a well-functioning community of service providers that collaborate well. That's my understanding. We have constellations of service providers in Sweden that work well together, but not necessarily all. And we also have use of PEPPOL, yeah. So, and from now on, PEPPOL Science is the one that we are referring to. The legislation points to the European standard, but the policy and the guidelines from DIG, the Digitalization Authority, specifically points to PEPPOL Science for implementation. So that is what the public entities are doing. And they are implementing through PEPPOL, so now we have almost 100% of the central government is registered already since last year in PEPPOL, and about 90% of the municipalities are registered now in PEPPOL as receivers of the European standard. For publicly owned companies, it is around 20%, which is a problem because the law says you must be able. Obviously, they aren't. And for legislation in Sweden, it's similar to Norway. Similar to Denmark. We have now a law that mandates suppliers to send electronic invoices both above and below threshold. So even if you go out and buy something, you know, directly without a proper tender, then it still has to be an electronic invoice. Any purchase needs to be electronic, unless you do it like cash and receipt. That's not. But otherwise, it has to be electronic. And we also have the possibility to fine suppliers who are continuing to use paper or the wrong formats. Norway, 70–80% of the invoice amounts or flows of invoices are electronic. They use UBL. Of course, you know, I'm sure that they are big PEPPOL friends. The PEPPOL Science with domestic rules. They will continue with PEPPOL. And their legislation, this slide isn't updated, it has 3 dots, so I got some information yesterday. They have implemented the directive as is. They say that in tenders, they must require electronic invoices. So that's a way of handling it. It's not by law as we have it in Sweden. They also have the possibility that if a supplier is not sending an electronic invoice, even though you have required it, then you're not required to pay. So that's quite an efficient way to get adoption.
Question?
Yes?
Why we have to register our address in PEPPOL network, but also in Norway network?
You say that you have to register.
Yeah.
Well,
both. Why?
But that's not that you don't have to.
Yes, we have. At least our invoice operator said that they have to register that in Norway as well?
No, that's not correct. They should do. You should ask them again.
Okay.
But sometimes, as a service provider in PEPPOL, you sign a set of agreements to become a certified service provider or an access point.
Okay.
And to be listed in Norway on the Norwegian list of access points, then you also have to sign an annex to the contract with Norway. But that is it's a one-time thing that the service provider has to do. So it has nothing to do with registration of the receivers. It's just to becoming an access point. Perhaps that's what it's.
Okay, one question adding on top of this that Tieke was asking, is it mandated for example, in a PEPPOL network to publish the receivers in an SML?
Yes.
It's mandated.
If you want to be a receiver in PEPPOL,
Yep.
then you must be in the PEPPOL registry. Otherwise, you're not in PEPPOL.
And the continuing question: for the certified access point, is it mandated to make the lookup from the SML and not directly from the local SMP? You understand my point, because this is just the issue that in practice is faced, that certain service providers are saying you are not published in an Elmo, we can't send you.
But then it's not correct.
It's not correct.
They have somewhere has been a misunderstanding. If you to be visible in the PEPPOL network, you need to be registered in the SML.
Correct.
And then your registry, if it's Elma or if it's a Finnish one or if it's something that the service provider is providing, many registries, you can be registered in one of those. But if you want to be visible, then you have to be in the SML, because the SML points you to the registry.
But that's the problem, that the participant, the end customer, is not having an how to say, control on that. It's actually on an access point or in SMP, and that's something that needs to be very clear, that it's mandated that the participant addresses are published in SML. Otherwise, it never going to.
Yeah, I think the definition of being a receiver in PEPPOL is that you are a participant, and then you are in the SML too. So if you're not in the SML, you are not. I would say, a definition, you are not a PEPPOL receiver. Otherwise, it just becomes a local
island.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'll continue. In the Netherlands, they have central government 50%, regional and local, a very low level. They use UBL. They have a central hub, and then they use PEPPOL. They also have something called simpler Invoice, which is a collaboration between service providers. They have their own country-specific SIAS, but they also will accept the PEPPOL SIAS. And the plans for infrastructure for the future is to use the PEPPOL infrastructure, and the legislation as is from the directive. And they also mandate the central government to require e-invoicing in new contracts. So Austria also central government high level. The rest is a bit unclear. They have a domestic XML format and UBL. They use centralized service and PEPPOL in parallel. They have actually two different SIASes. One with country-specific rules and one specifically for the government. And then they use PEPPOL for cross-border. So for their perspective is not to use PEPPOL domestically, but for cross-border. And they will continue to have this approach. And they don't have any specific further restrictions on the legislation than what's in the directive. Let's take another small country, Cyprus. They don't have any e-invoicing today. Of course, then no infrastructure or syntax. They are using the PEPPOL SIAS, and they are implementing the directive as is. So that is in a way, PEPPOL has provided a solution for many countries to live up to the directive, to be able to receive electronic invoices. So to connect to PEPPOL, then you're off the hook. Otherwise, the country needs to, if you're not using PEPPOL, you need to come up with some other approach, like setting up a central hub or building your own infrastructure. Some countries are doing that, but it's a lot of investments. Here, you can just make sure that you have a service provider and you live up to the rules. Croatia, they're using UBL since before. They have a centralized solution. They are going to use PEPPOL, and they also have domestic sites, according to information from them, and also then using PEPPOL, and there is mandatory to send, so more like Swedish approach. Yeah.
Sorry, just curiosity. What's the situation in the UK?
Yeah. To my knowledge, the transposition is as is. I don't think they have gone further. That's my understanding. I'm not an authoritative source on this, but the NHS, the health sector, is using PEPPOL for their purchases, and they have to NHS have been in PEPPOL for a few years now.
Okay.
But that's just even though it's a big portion of the government spend, it's still far from all.
Yeah.
So.
I think it's important to have a distinction here because the UK is also including, of course, Scotland and Wales. Scotland is quite advanced within the Invoice and the PEPPOL network.
No, not so much in PEPPOL, but they have a centralized.
They do have a transition towards it. The country of England is not, so it depends on where. They do have a number of service providers. So
yeah, there are many service providers.
Many service providers engaged in the PEPPOL network as well as on the standard as such. So they are offering the services for companies.
But one reason why it's hard to answer these questions is that it's a little bit of, this is a changing landscape. These policy questions to decide on these topics are, I think many countries are lagging behind on setting policies on this. And sometimes there is no central policy. It's up to anybody to decide how to implement and live up to the directive. But of course that makes it very complicated for the suppliers if you have to check with every customer, how do I send invoices to you? Okay, some questions from if we update to PEPPOL version 3, sending and send an invoice to a receiver company with only BIS2 support, what happens? Is the standard backwards compatible? So if a receiver only can receive version 2 and the sender only version 3, that shouldn't happen in PEPPOL because version 3 is mandatory since 2 weeks back. So if you have a situation like that, then it's because someone has been dragging behind in building this mandatory support. It's not backward compatible. Version 3 is different. It has new rules, so you have to make changes. One example is that the party names, buyer and seller names, are not in the same place anymore. They have moved from one element to another element in the new standard. And that's an example, a very, very obvious example that there has been changes. So what we've seen so far, and this is of course, I think perhaps Finland is the country that sticks out here. And the countries that we have been to, which has been successful in e-invoicing or has a strong will to do e-invoicing, they often have a very strong public sector. The public sector has taken the leader stick, and is issuing policies and standards and infrastructure. I think it has been more organic in Finland, where with banks and service providers working and finding consensus and so on. And then the public sector also involved, but not as the leaders. Is that correct?
Yes.
But in most other countries, I would say that it is more driven from public sector on which standards to use, the migration between standards. So, yeah. Let's see. It's now we have. That's fine. So you have the graphs. Yeah. So should we do that one?
How much do you have?
Sorry, we got a bit.
No, I think we should continue with this.
Okay, all right. Let's talk about this cross-border aspects a little bit more. The standard, I showed this slide before. The standard is defining the interconnectivity between the buyer and seller on a semantic and syntactical level. It means that you have to have software for generation of the invoice and receiving. But when it comes to the interchange, the standard doesn't say anything about that. There's a report from TC44 mentioning different approaches, but it's nothing authoritative or nothing that even describing how you should do. So here we are on our own. The standard doesn't say anything, and the directive doesn't say anything either. So we have a directive that says it's mandatory to receive. We even have many countries that says it's mandatory to send, but it's often unclear how. So can I require my invoices to be sent through bicycle and USB pins, or FTP to my FTP inbox with this password and user account, or PEPPOL, or a specific service provider, or a cluster of service providers? I mean, these are a number of the ecosystem in the e-invoicing industry on how to interchange. The standard doesn't say anything about it, and the directive doesn't say anything about it. This is, of course, a challenge from an interoperability perspective. As a supplier within the country, it often makes it gets a little bit cleared. So here in Finland, people know how to do it, and the service providers work together and so on. In some countries, it's more complicated. Like in Sweden, we have now some municipalities who only use PEPPOL, and we have others that only use a van operator. So there is as a sender, you need to have double capability. So there's not one solution that fits everything, for the moment at least. And particularly if you're coming from the outside, or if you're trading with many countries at the same time, you are faced with a lot of different alternatives. I heard an example of an American country that each month, that when they were sending invoices, they had customers all over Europe. They had to log into 200 e-invoicing portals every month for keying in their invoices. 200. That's waste of time. Very error prone. And perhaps this is obvious to you, but in one approach, the three-corner model approach, you have a centralized system and everybody connects to this centralized system. This has been a traditional way of doing tenders, but also e-invoicing. In some countries are going for this approach, where it solves a lot of issues on interoperability and connectivity. Everybody has to go to the same place and interchange through that central system. But for the suppliers, they might be acting with other customers who were in other countries with centralized system, and you have to connect to many of these, and this is causing, and you cannot decide on your own which is most convenient or efficient for you. The four-corner model, which you're using here in Finland, then you have service providers who collaborate in some context. They have agreement with each other, they know each other. If something goes wrong, they have exchanged contact information about support and stuff like that. They have agreements on which transport protocols to use. And when you connect to your service provider, and the messages can be transmitted here. And the problem with this approach, in many other countries at least, is that you often have to provide information also as a supplier which service provider the buyer is using, because you don't have any addressing lookup mechanism. And I think you solved that in Finland with interchanging like an address list. But in Sweden we don't have that. So if either you connect through a service provider that has this knowledge because they built it up, so they know which service providers that the receivers have, or you have to provide this information to your service provider every time you make a new connection, which is just crazy. It's like, I need to know which telecom operator you are using, otherwise I can't call you. And this is particularly being problematic when a buyer is changing to a new service provider, because if I then connect to my new service provider, I need to inform everybody that I have now a new service provider. Again, in Finland, you solve this through by exchanging this addressing functionality. Very much like PEPPOL. So in PEPPOL, PEPPOL is, you can describe it as 3 components: the e-delivery network, the BIS, the science specifications for messages, and also the governing organization, Open PEPPOL. And within PEPPOL, the service providers also becomes access point providers. It's normally the same companies who's offering these, but then they have this capability of being a service provider. And in PEPPOL, you also have an addressing mechanism. It's a bit more complex than this. It's not one central database. It's many registries with one central locator. So yeah, and let's not go into all the details, but that's just functionally, from a user perspective, it's one addressing lookup mechanism. So the supplier is providing his invoice to his service provider. The service provider is making a lookup in the addressing mechanism, and the response from the lookup is which service provider is my customer using, so that I can send the invoice to that service provider and it can hand it over to the customer. In the addressing lookup, it says which access point and which format can the receiver receive. So there's no risk of sending a PEPPOL-BIS version 2 to someone that only supports version 3, because already when you make the addressing lookup, you will make sure that you get the information about which versions and which document types the receiver actually supports. So if you support orders but not invoices, then you will not receive invoices. So it's as simple as that. And when someone is changing service providers from one to another, this is for many the strongest reason for using PEPPOL. For others, it's the biggest problem with PEPPOL, because my customers, if I'm a service provider, my customers can more easily migrate to one of my competitors, because it's enough to just update the address book and and then the next invoice is going to this new access point that you have changed to. Very much again like in phone telecom. I don't need to inform everybody that I changed my operator. The call is being transmitted automatically through my use operator. So this is the approach. The registries, because as there are many, they are provided either by the service providers themselves. In the case of Norway, they have one centralized, called ELMA, one central registry. But since there is this centralized locator that helps you find the correct registry automatically, it doesn't matter if there are more than one registry, because you are always going to be directed to the correct registry automatically. And in the invoice, we have something called the PEPPOL ID, or the endpoint ID. It has many names, this element. In the European standard, it's called the electronic address identifier. It is the same as the invoice address in paper. This is the electronic invoice address. It's a mandatory element in the PEPPOL SIAS. It's also mentioned on the envelope in the invoice. So the service provider or the access point can just use the envelope information to send the invoice to the correct location. And it has a structure with a prefix which says which type of number I'm using as my PEPPOL ID, and then the ID itself. So in this case, 0007 means the Swedish organization number, and then comes the Swedish organization, and then all of this becomes my PEPPOL ID. So this is like my phone number in PEPPOL. And the benefit of that is that it's quite easy to communicate this to the suppliers. I hit 2 examples. Swedish Coast Guard. If you go on the page on Contact Us Invoicing, it says that we prefer PEPPOL, and our electronic address in PEPPOL is, and this is the number. So you don't have to say anything more than that, because the PEPPOL BIS3 is mandatory. So you don't even have to say which format you're using, just use PEPPOL. And this is the big change for us from before, because then you had to say we are using this service provider, so make sure that your service provider is collaborating with my service provider, and we use Verkkolaskutus 1, or we use this and that. And you know, it's a lot of information to communicate to your suppliers, and now it's more modern, I would say. This is more user-centric. Yeah, and this is the envelope information. Leave that. In PEPPOL, we have PEPPOL authorities, and that is governmental authorities that takes extra responsibility for the implementation of PEPPOL in that country. It's not necessary, like in Finland you don't have a PEPPOL authority, you can still be a PEPPOL access point. Is that when you're entering into PEPPOL as a service provider, you need to sign your agreements with the PEPPOL authority, but you can sign with the Swedish PEPPOL authority if you want to. So that there's not a necessity that you have a national PEPPOL authority, even though it helps in communication and so on. We have now 12 that coming in. This might be the latest slide. It might be more. The latest one to enter in is Singapore, which is the first non-European PEPPOL authority, and that's very good. We also have Australia and New Zealand entering into PEPPOL. I don't know if they're becoming PEPPOL authorities or not. There are numbers. A lot of numbers. This is the number of receivers in PEPPOL up till March this year. It's 190,000 receivers or endpoints in PEPPOL. So there are much more senders. In the registry is only the receivers that are registered. So there are more senders than that, but 190,000. The majority of these are Norwegian. But it's growing more quickly outside of Norway than within Norway. That's a good sign. And here are some, or all, at least a few months ago, the access points that are certified in PEPPOL. So there's quite a lot of them. Many of them are specifically connected to a specific ERP system, for example. Some are more generic service providers. I think you'll find more or less all the Finnish service providers in here. The countries that I mentioned before at the side is which PEPPOL authority they are working with. No. That's which country they come from. Sorry. So it's quite a lot. One development that we see is that it's not only the traditional van operators that becomes access point, but we also now have more and more ERP systems becoming access points, like SAP, for example, which is an interesting development, similar to what they saw in Denmark, where when they legislated mandatory invoicing, it also became an argument for the ERP systems to implement the standards directly instead of always relying on third parties. That goes for some service providers, but of course there are many that don't have this capability. So.